Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, here with my co-host, Alan Reineck, who is executive director of the Church State Council. And together we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. So how are you doing today, Alan?
I'm doing great. Arizona has cooled off, and it was nice and chilly this morning.
And Washington, D.C., the temperature is still climbing. That's literally and I think probably metaphorically as well.
Absolutely. Well, what are we going to talk about today, Bettina?
Well, I tell you a case that caught my eye just last week, and that was in Colorado. Two religious preschools, they're Catholic preschools. They filed suit for participation in full state funding. Now, for anyone who's been around the issues of religious liberty for a while, you know that traditionally state funding for religious schools, direct state funding, it just simply hasn't been deemed constitutionally okay. Yet something happened quite recently in one of the recent Supreme Court terms, Alan, Carson versus Macon. What happened with that case, and why does it make a difference to whether these preschools are going to get their state funding?
Well, it's been a trend that has been coming for some time. I filed a brief in the Supreme Court back in 2000 in a case called Mitchell versus Helms, which really marked the turning point. The principle for decades has been separation of church and state means that the state doesn't give money directly to religious institutions. That rule has been completely turned upside down. And in the state of Maine, in the case that you referred to, Maine has a program. There are some, rural counties that are, relatively modest in population and areas that cannot sustain a public high school. And so Maine would provide funding if kids were going to a private high school in lieu of, a public school being too far away, and they'd provide tuition assistance for private non-religious high schools, but they would not provide, consistent with their own state constitution and the First Amendment, would not provide the same funding for the religious high schools. And the Supreme Court said, that's not okay. That's a form of discrimination. And so you have to fund the religious schools on the same basis as you're funding the secular. If that principle is carried logically, then what we're facing is essentially the complete blending of public and private education in this country, because you'll have the same level of funding provided by the state or some measure of public funding of both private and public education.
Right.
That's
And
where this Colorado case is going.
So, Alan, and some people may be listening to what you just said and say, well, what's wrong with the total blending of public and private education? I mean, public and religious education. Why is that an issue?
I mean, obviously, yeah, some people will hear this and cheer, right? And say, that's fantastic. So the critiques fall into two basic categories. And I will admit right at the outset that I'm absolutely against public funding of religious education. So I was involved in a voucher battle in California back in, I want to say 2000. And it's very clear when you listen to advocates of public education, advocates of the separation of church and state, that with government funds will inevitably come the strings, right? Public accountability. So there's a lot of issues, whether it's the teaching of creation versus evolution, teaching about human sexuality, all kinds of what we would call traditional values and biblical in terms of Christian education, that the state in many places will simply say, you can't do that with our funds. And so the funding, it's a Trojan horse. It sows the seeds of the destruction of Christian education. Um,
So it's so interesting, Alan, because that brings to mind what happened directly after the decision, the Maine decision in Carson versus Macon, because the Attorney General of Maine then proceeded to say, okay, if we have to fund religious schools on the same basis as secular schools, then we're going to include some conditions on their participation, and they involve issues of non-discrimination of LGBTQ individuals, which, you know, for some religious schools who hold to a traditional understanding of human sexuality, they see that as an infringement on their
well,
religious
but Tina,
freedom, right?
we don't even need to go there. Okay,
Right.
so we're both Seventh Day Adventist leaders, and the Adventist Church has a very large Christian education system, which is very important to to our church,
Mhm.
to our families, to provide a Christian education. And one of our values is that in order to inculcate our Christian faith, we expect our teachers to be Seventh day Adventist believers, right? And
Mhm.
to model the lifestyle and to teach the principles of our faith. Well, all of these funding programs have generic non discrimination requirements. And if a state decides to actually apply it, it means that Seventh day Adventist schools can no longer prefer hiring Seventh day Adventists or even Christians. And the same holds true if you're Baptist, Lutheran, Catholic, or whatever, that you will have to hire faculty who do not teach or represent your values. And there goes the entire culture and environment of the Christian school. Then it becomes effectively a public school.
So here's the thing, Alan, and let me put on the record right now that I am in firm agreement with everything you've said and also with your stance on state funding for religious institutions. But let me play devil's advocate if I may. And I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but here's the thing. Some parents listening may say, I send my kid to the local public school, and what they're learning is not neutral. It's putting a thumb on the scale toward in favor of a certain orthodoxy that is in line with secular ideology. I okay, so
There's a lot of valid critiques of public
yeah,
education if you're a Christian. Absolutely.
and so the question is, well, then isn't this a valid sort of evening up of the scale? You know? So, okay, if the government is going to fund its own secular orthodoxy, it should also fund the orthodoxy of religious groups. Devil's advocate.
Look, and I understand. I had a church leader come to me years ago, and he said he was speaking to a group of Hispanics, and virtually none of those kids could afford Christian education. But the problem is that here in America, we're a very wealthy country, and if we as church members put our money where our mouth is and invested in Christian education, we can afford to provide every child in America who wants a Christian education with a free or means appropriate, tested cost of education. It's not really a matter of money, it's a matter of spiritual vitality. And when we become, we talk about from, conservatives will say, will criticize that welfare makes people lazy and dependent. But the same is true of corporate welfare. If we as a church are educating our kids on public tax money, well, then church members become lazy and dependent, and that saps our spiritual vitality. It's a lose-lose equation. And we're going to have a lot more conversations about this.
You're absolutely right, Alan. We have a whole heap more to discuss on that issue, but we are going to switch gears quite significantly now and talk about an international issue. The International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which sounds kind of dry in the abstract, but really it is such an interesting area of how US foreign policy is advancing religious freedom, right?
Not just religious freedom, but saving lives and dealing with people who are arrested and persecuted for their faith. It's the most important thing we can do.
Absolutely. Well, let's bring Knox on. So, welcome, Knox. We're so glad you're with us. Knox Thames is an international human rights lawyer, he's an advocate, an author, and he's dedicated his career to promoting the rights of religious minorities and combating persecution. He has served for 20 years in the US government and in a number of key positions, including at the State Department, where both the Obama and Trump administrations appointed him as special advisor for religious minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia. He is currently a senior fellow at Pepperdine University, and he's also a well-known media commentator on issues relating to international religious freedom. Thanks so much. We're so glad you're here.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
So, okay, Knox, let's start out with the basics. The International Religious Freedom Act. This sort of kicked off a new era in US foreign policy back in 1998. What was this in a nutshell? What was this piece of legislation?
Yeah, that's the right way to frame it, as a new era. It was a groundbreaking piece of legislation where for the first time, the United States would be promoting human rights as directed by our Congress internationally. Of course, issues of religious freedom are a foundational American ideal. It's what so many of the first settlers were fleeing religious persecution in Europe, and came to these shores to practice their belief peacefully without fear of violence or discrimination. And so in the late 90s, after the end of the Cold War, there was a sense that there was an opportunity for the United States to promote and encourage this right abroad in other countries, not to dictate or export the First Amendment, which has been, of course, so important to the development of our own country and protecting religious liberties at home, but out of recognition, firstly, of the tide of persecution that was sweeping the globe, and secondly, that countries will have a brighter future. They'll be better partners for the United States. Their people will enjoy a brighter future if this fundamental human right is respected and protected at home. So it launched a whole range of tools and mechanisms, which was truly groundbreaking 25 years ago.
So, Knox, if I may, thinking about the history in the post-World War II era, surely America very consciously was projecting our values of freedom and human rights globally in our relations with other countries. But this bipartisan legislation in the late 90s represents a bit of a sea change, doesn't it? And if you can explain, why was it a game changer?
Well, religious persecution is as old as human history. And so much of the United Nations system that emerged after the World War II was created because of the Holocaust, of the targeting for extermination of people because of their religion and ethnicity. And the United States leading this, but other countries said never again. And we need to establish standards to protect individuals from violence that targets them because of their faith or belief. So that had been in place for several decades, but in the late 90s, we realized that wasn't enough. These UN standards were important. These UN tools could play a crucial role, but with the influence of the United States, the unmatched power, especially at that time at the end of the Cold War, there was an opportunity to encourage countries through direct diplomacy to protect the belief rights of their own citizens. And, were we foisting our values on others? Well, we were. The founding legislation points to these UN documents, which were approved by every country in the world. So this wasn't about the U.S. forcing our values on others, but rather pointing to a common standard that we'd all agreed to uphold, and welcoming criticisms of our own country. We're not perfect, but at the same time understanding a bad day for religious freedom in the United States beats a good day in so many other countries around the world, like China, Iran, Saudi Arabia. And so there is a positive role for the United States to play in this regard.
So it's interesting to me, Knox, that you're not talking about this from an academic perspective because you actually lived this legislation in the sense that for a good part of, was it 2 decades? You were
Yes. Yep.
intimately involved in, the guts of this, making it work. And I'd be really interested to know, you know, from that internal perspective, where did you see this legislation actually push the needle forward in a positive sense? And when that happened, what were the tools that were being used?
Firstly, it was a great privilege to represent our country on these issues of such importance, but also of intimate concern to individuals around the world from all faith communities and none. I saw that, but for the United States involvement in certain situations, changes would never come. People would not be released from jail. And so the U.S. was a force for good in the world on this issue, and it continues to be today. That being said, policymakers are always confronting a multitude of challenges. The United States is a superpower. We have to balance security, trade, energy, counterterrorism, along with promoting human rights. It does make our engagements more complicated, but we do that because we believe it's an American value and we believe it's in our interest. Again, going back to the point that countries that get this right are better partners, are more stable, are not at war with themselves. So when the U.S. was able to really leverage our full force and weight and economic influence, diplomatic influence, we saw conditions improve. Countries like Vietnam, Uzbekistan, even Saudi Arabia made changes that wouldn't have happened had the United States not had these tools that the International Religious Freedom Act gave the State Department, gave the White House. Again, these countries aren't perfect. There's still a lot more progress that we hope to see happen. But it's undeniable that these tools gave the United States special abilities that did see people released from jail, oppressive systems changed or at least moderated, and individuals able to pursue truth as their conscience leads.
Well, that sounds really good in the abstract. And certainly the notion that individuals in particular were helped, to be released. That's a very concrete accomplishment. But as you describe the influence on countries like Saudi Arabia, kind of my cynicism begins to sort of kick in because, of course, it's still perceived as a very oppressive country. Is there a specific example of a change that, whether it's Saudi or Uzbekistan, I know Vietnam has opened up considerably, but there's still problems. Can you point to a specific that would help our listeners really appreciate a concrete example of something that we as Americans can be proud of?
Well, I think of the case of Asia Bibi, who was a Catholic mother in Pakistan who was sentenced to death on bogus charges of blasphemy. She was in jail for 7 years. And I was at the State Department and other government positions during her whole saga. And I saw how these tools that the United States had because of the act, public reports on religious freedom violations in Pakistan, the threat and possibility of naming Pakistan to a blacklist of the worst violators of religious freedom, and the diplomatic avenues that created for real strong engagement to insist that this innocent woman be let go, eventually led to her release. And I don't think that would have happened as soon as it did, and it took 7 years, without these tools. Now, critics will say, look, persecution seems to be unrelenting. The Pew Center has these statistics that almost 2 out of every 3 people on earth live in environments that restrict the free practice of faith, and that's true. But I have to think and I have to ask, well, how much more worse would it be if these reports,
Sure.
if these diplomatic priorities, if this empowerment of American diplomacy hadn't been created back in 1998? I think the world would be a much darker and more violent place for religious freedom.
Well, since you mentioned, if you hang on a second, Bettina, because since you mentioned the Asia Bibi situation, it leads me to ask about the relationship here with what I would call a public-private partnership, because certainly the American people were kept very well informed by a variety of religious interest groups and religious liberty groups, and there was an awful lot of advocacy within the United States to highlight her situation. And I'm wondering the extent to which the engagement of the American people, impacts priorities or effectiveness of what your work with the State Department has been.
Well, I mean, firstly, I know there were huge prayer campaigns for her, and as a Christian, I believe in the power of prayer, and that is an important activity that we can all partake, and we need to do more and every day to remember our brothers and sisters and those outside our faith who suffer persecution because of their beliefs, but also them signaling to our elected leaders that religious freedom matters is the kind of political energy that people like me, when I was in the bureaucracy, really helped me push issues forward. Because when political leaders knew this mattered to people back home, suddenly it mattered in Washington in a way that it might receive lip service, but it would fade down the priority list. So it's really important. And this is a concern I have, is as domestic religious liberty has become more partisan, it's making the international work, which is very different. It's life and death. It's not the nuanced debates we have at home. It's people sentenced to death for blasphemy. It's churches being burned down. It's genocide against Muslims in China or Burma. That it's starting to create fissures. I'm afraid it's going to pollute the international work. And so it's just critical that people around the United States continue to communicate to their elected leaders, congressmen, senators, even President Biden, that this issue matters. And we want the United States to continue to lead, promoting this right for everybody, because it's an American value, because it's in our interest, and it's because who we are as a country.
So, Knox, we've got just a couple minutes left to talk, but I'm wondering, as you're no longer with the State Department, and so looking back over your time there, do you have a sense that the International Religious Freedom Act has fulfilled its potential, or do you think that it has still got further to go in order to realize what it set out to achieve in the first place?
I think that's the right question to be asking, especially this year, as it's the 25th anniversary of the act. Like I said, it was groundbreaking. It created new offices at the State Department, a special ambassador, a special commission, these global reports, and they've all served an important purpose. But we know that, evil continues to innovate. Oppressors continue to find new ways to oppress people that they are afraid of, whose beliefs they disagree with or hate. And so those of us who value freedom of religion or belief, those of us who value human rights, we've got to make sure our government continues to innovate as well. These tools have served us well. They need to be, I think, re-energized, maybe dusted off a bit and given a bit of a checkup, an oil lube, so to speak, to make sure they're good for another 25 years. But we also need to give our government new tools to meet the challenge of Chinese persecution, violent extremism, and just sort of the subtle repression of dictatorships. These are all challenges that the 21st century presents that this bill that was written in the 20th century couldn't even imagine. And so it's incumbent upon us to continue to innovate and insist that we do everything we can to promote this right globally.
The example of China to me is just the most frustrating sort of situation because when we look at American policy toward China, you've got this, this genocide taking place with the Uyghur Muslims, but there's so many interests and complexity to the American relationship with China, and it just seems as though we've been relatively powerless to influence China to change its course on persecution.
China is the toughest nut to crack. And I am pleased that Congress has passed new laws that was signed into act by President Biden to ensure that companies that source labor or goods in the Uyghur regions of China aren't using slave labor. That's an important way to leverage our, we're the world's largest economy. The privilege, it's not a right to trade with us. It's a privilege that if you're going to import things, we don't want slave labor to taint it. But at the same time, while China is difficult to move, other countries pay attention to how we treat China. And so we shouldn't just because it may not work in China doesn't mean it isn't influencing other countries because they don't want to have the same restrictions placed on them because they're not China. They're not as big and as powerful. So there's this second and third tier reverberations that can have great impact and actually prevent persecution. It can be peremptory because governments, officials, extremists will decide, I don't want to run afoul of that because I've seen what happened to officials in China. If they're willing to do that to China, well, my little country, of course they'll do that here. So again, I think doing the right thing is always the best policy. And while it may not play out in the target country, we can't underestimate the impact it can have more broadly in other regions and with other actors.
So thank you so much, Knox. This has been a fantastic conversation. I sense that we have a part 2 in our future somewhere. There's too much to cover, but thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
That was just a fantastic discussion with Knox Thames, wasn't it, Bettina?
Yeah, I mean, so interesting. And, he's someone who has had such close-up involvement with the administration of that particular piece of legislation. It's interesting to hear his critiques of it, as well as, the times where he's seen it work in practice. And I have to say, Alan, I first met Knox when he was at the State Department and I was representing the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And, he and his office were incredibly helpful in a number of situations that we faced as a global church, where we as religious minorities were experiencing discrimination and worse.
Well, that's really encouraging to know. Americans, I think, have a general sense that there's a lot of persecution around the world, but we have really no idea of just how engaged our own government is in dealing with these issues. And to me, it's one of the bright spots. And the fact that it's been bipartisan, that this has endured through, a series of, it was started under the Clinton administration, continued under 2 terms of Bush, 2 terms of Obama, right? And into Trump and Biden. And, here we are through a variety of governments. We have continued to press persecutors to, change their ways.
Yeah, the thing that really stood out for me from that interview, and it's something that I think would be great to explore with Knox again, is he raised that issue of the partisanship at home, the domestic divide on issues of religious freedom, and the fear that it could start to taint this bipartisan international effort. And, to me, that is a massive concern. And I guess it's something, what do you do? How do you even begin to combat that, right?
Well, I think we're going to have to do some programming, Bettina, and explore what the parameters of that divide are and how religious freedom now has become a partisan culture war football, if you will. And it's certainly problematic both domestically and in terms of foreign policy to make, instead of religious freedom being a fundamental value and right, then it becomes something to fight over.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's what we have already seen to a certain extent in foreign policy issues relating to access to abortion, LGBTQ rights, and how far that plays into the promotion of religious freedom abroad. So we have seen it sort of start to leak into the conversation of international religious freedom, especially in those 2 areas. But you're right, we need to explore more what we are up against in this domestic polarization.
Well, and it strikes me, as you mentioned, these other culture war topics, they're not entirely removed from religious freedom, are they?
No, no.
There are countries that are persecuting LGBT persons out of a misplaced religious zeal, if you will.
Right, exactly. Uganda, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm. And, thinking about abortion, whatever one's views on it, it certainly is a life and death issue, isn't it?
So it sounds like we've got a lot of, let's say, interesting conversations ahead of us, Alan.
We sure do. And listeners, I hope that you'll stay with us for some fun and fantastic conversations. This has been Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach here with Bettina Krause. Until next time, remember,
eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.